At last, at long last, I've been waiting for this opportunity for years. Welcome, friends, to a different view of the Night Mind office. We've covered a lot of visual media, and even written media, but we've gone too long for my liking in not addressing one of the most influential forces in dark media: the history of horror comics. In our American Horror Stories video during our Wicked Root celebration a few Octobers ago, we explored the impact of Weird Tales on the formation of the past century's wave of horror media. Much of Weird Tales was purely printed word, with some illustration, mainly in the highly attractive covers. But even the publishers there understood as time went on how powerful the visual side of the content could be, ever pushing for more attractive covers and illustrations to accompany their stories. It was no surprise as Weird Tales increased in popularity that the growing comics industry recognized the opportunity to join the magazine in delivering dark delights. While success had come from stories of Cape Crusaders for several years, readers were getting tired of an overabundance of superhero tales, and stories that were safe. Thus entered the one-shot horror comic, Eerie, in January of 1947, the first of its kind. A test by Avon Periodicals, it was 52 pages, 10 cents, contained 6 stories, and did poorly in sales, resulting in a freeze by Avon on the idea of subsequent issues for a while. That didn't stop another experiment by American Comics Group the following year, however, with their offering, Adventures into the Unknown. And perhaps they felt more confident with their attempt, considering the first issue was written by longtime Weird Tales author and close friend of H.P. Lovecraft, Frank Belknap Long. This experimental line survived where Eerie had folded, continuing well past its first issue, and perhaps giving courage to the publisher EC Comics, who decided to test horror content in an issue of their existing series, Crime Patrol, in January 1950, which introduced their soon-to-be legendary horror host, the Crypt Keeper. The experiment was well received enough to try turning the balance on the next issue, offering more scary stories. And an issue after that, they went all in, renaming Crime Patrol to the Crypt of Terror. In short time, this title was reworked to be the legendary Tales from the Crypt. This wasn't the end of EC's work in horror stories by far. Their excitement almost became what could be considered a mania or attempt to dominate an almost non-existent field. They introduced the Vault of Horror as another horror anthology, and the Haunt of Fear alongside Tales from the Crypt, giving readers 3 series and 3 horror hosts. The gates to hell in the comics world opened hard and fast, unleashing a torrent of grisly tales, nightmarish depictions, and stories of immorality, many presided over by the horror hosts EC created, who relished the evils within and delighted in the disgust of readers. In 4 years, the mark made by horror comics and the comic industry in general was included in a congressional hearing about national juvenile delinquency, and federal inquiries were cast into the companies creating and distributing material that could be considered perverse to American youth. This resulted in the birth of the Comics Code Authority, which can be considered the grandfather of the infamous parental advisory sticker that would later come from the endless rantings and ravings of the original Karen, Tipper Gore. The Comics Code Authority was so targeted in its rulings that it determined the words horror, terror, or weird could not be used on the covers of comic books, meaning an immediate death blow to EC's horror line. But by the dawning of the Comics Code Authority, there was no putting the mummy back in the coffin. Tales from the Crypt alone had produced 27 issues by the time it ended publication, Haunt of Fear produced 28, and The Vault of Horror produced 29. There were enough issues loose in the world and in the hands of readers and horror media creators who now knew they would be rare that they became more sacred, and the impact they created on the audience would last for decades. Here's an excerpt from the foreword to Tales from the Crypt Volume 2, an EC Archives reprint by Dark Horse, from director Joe Dante. I found my tattered, moldy Tales from the Crypt in an open field behind my backyard, appropriately adjacent to the hopping funeral home where my little brother was once found hiding inside a coffin, but that's a different story. This was the same rocky field that I was convinced giant ants crawled out of at night after I saw them. The brain-sizzling images in this comic, which in retrospect seem to me to have been drawn by the legendary Jack Davis, were gross, disturbing, horrific, and altogether fascinating. Rotting corpses, dismembered limbs, graveyard ghouls, terrified victims, violent deaths, bloody orbs dangling from gory sockets. It's hard even today to convey just how primal the impact was. I squirreled this damp, soiled prize away among my other comics so I could revisit its forbidden horror surreptitiously. I knew, of course, that somehow this was something so wrong that my parents would freak if they knew I had it. And sure enough, next time I went to look for it, it was gone. I wasn't to revisit or appreciate my short introduction to the EC landscape until many years later. But now, thanks in large part to Russ Cochran and Gemstone, Bill Gaines's notorious groundbreaking comics have taken their rightful place as part of American culture, looking better than they did when originally issued. These brilliantly subversive images by some of the greatest comic artists of the era, such as Wally Wood, Al Williamson, Harvey Kurtzman, John Severin, Reed Crandall, and Will Elder, have at long last attained the status of true Americana after years of derision and neglect. And today's kids and their grandparents don't have to scrabble in the dirt to find them. Another massive force of modern horror, Stephen King, was so influenced by EC's line of horror tales that his very first film writing credit was 1982's Creepshow, directed by George Romero. The movie was effectively an EC comic turned into a film. 5 short stories, composed by King, with a wraparound plot involving a young boy collecting an issue of his favorite horror comic, Creepshow, and its horror host come to life, The Creep. That was far from the only live-action influence, of course, as the Tales from the Crypt name and idea was also adapted for the TV show Tales from the Crypt 7 years later, featuring a live-action version of the Crypt Keeper, who had apparently decayed significantly over the decades since the Comics Code Authority crippled the print line, but he hadn't lost any of his spirit. And, as I naturally am, I'm sure many of you are also fans of the Shudder original series Creepshow, which keeps the love of horror comics introduced by King and Romero alive under their tributary banner. Issues of EC comics such as Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear are precisely the sort of old treasures one might find digging through the old boxes and suitcases of long-kept storage, squirreled away in the same fashion Joe Dante once kept his grim discovery. In honor of this often overlooked vein of horror media, we're using this year's Monster Hunt to visit the sort of terrors you would find in the pages of EC's tales, and doing so in the fashion of that legendary monster of old, the incredibly influential early horror comic. Too great to survive its decade, but too great to stay locked away. So, come along then, dear readers, and allow me to take a turn as your horror host in a fashion even older than the living guide to the grim and gruesome. Welcome, friends, to this year's Monster Hunt. Once in a while, I find it's appropriate to examine a tale that falls more in line with monster lore of old, not simply to check a box, but to explore a horror story that seems embedded so deeply in urban legend status that it leaves you wondering what really happened. Facts that are agreed upon, circumstances too terrible and believable to dismiss. Such is the case of our first stop in New Orleans, Louisiana, sometime between 1932 and 1934. This, my friends, is the case of the Carter brothers. It was daytime on Royal Street in the French Quarter. The street cops were on normal patrol. Plenty of odd folks traveled the quarter, no matter the hour. But among the pedestrians, one girl in particular stood out. Young, stricken with a look of horror, with cuts on her wrists, still fresh. When a curious officer locked eyes with her, the realization was instant. She had been searching him out. Through shivering words, she managed to convey a message. She had just escaped from a house on the corner, where she and several others had been kept prisoner by a pair of men who had been drinking their blood. Her restraints had been carelessly made, allowing her to slip free, but the others remained trapped. As unbelievable as her claims were, the officer trusted the girl's words and assembled the strongest men from the force he could gather in a rush. They entered the home and immediately noticed the smell. Something faintly rancid, the air stale. The officers worked their way through the home, the smell growing stronger, until they came across the horror in a spare room. 4 people tied to chairs with bandages wrapped around bleeding limbs, in varying states of health, some near death. Other bodies laid nearby, covered with sheets and rags. the source of the rancid stench. The home belonged to a pair of brothers, John and Wayne Carter, dock workers who spent dawn to dusk on the job. The New Orleans police rescued the hostages, assembled a stronger team, and went to wait in the home for the brothers to return. When they arrived, they were caught by surprise, but to the officers' dismay, it took all of them to pin the two down. At normal height and weights, they each managed to handle several cops, putting up a shocking fight against the odds. When at last they were subdued, they seemed to come to their senses and began confessing on the spot, saying they needed to be murdered. "We're vampires," they cried, insisting that if they weren't put to death, they would never stop. The sun wasn't lethal to them, but the need for blood was real, and so was their hunger. Their victims ran into the dozens, and with the amount of disappearances in the city of New Orleans, it was too easy to see how they might have contributed. The Carter brothers were tried in court as kidnappers and murderers, and while their confessions were brought up, they weren't good for anything except guaranteeing death sentences. As such, the Carters were hanged, pronounced dead, and placed in their family crypt. Years later, when another Carter died, the crypt was opened to lay their body to rest, and the brothers were no longer inside. In the decades that followed, several people claimed to see John and Wayne around the city, beginning with a report from the new occupant of their former home, who swore that one night, two men were standing on the balcony, but when confronted, there was nobody there. The fear of the Carter brothers' afterlife persisted, but it was far from being the end of their horror. According to legend, the careless duo hadn't kept all of their victims human, having turned a few into members of a brood they didn't realize they created. One prior victim, Philippe, was the author of a diary found in a flop house on Bourbon Street, detailing his escape from the Carter home and subsequent life as a vampire, catching and draining 32 victims and spiraling into darkness. Others claim a far more deadly vampire emerged from the Carter brothers' accidental brood, one who kept sane enough to claim 442 victims and eliminated the remains, dissolving them in acid, but details outside of those are rare. The former home of the Carter brothers still stands to this day at the corner of Royal and St. Anne, 635 St. Anne Street to be specific. And when you visit, you can stop across the street at the New Orleans Vampire Cafe for a drink. Just be wary of any seductive strangers, or you may find yourself face to throat with a member of the Carter lineage. From the warmth and history of New Orleans, now we travel back to the East Coast for our next monster. You may have heard whispers of this one before, but tonight, we tell the story of a legendary terror whose tale shares some DNA with one of our previous entries, the Bunny Man. Introducing Maryland's favorite cryptid, the abomination known as the Goat Man. There aren't many straight facts about the Goat Man. Like many urban legends, this story depends on who you hear it from. They all take place in Prince George's County, and they all result in a goat man, but the variants go like this. In one edition of the tale, the Goat Man is simply a cryptid. Half goat, half man, all dangerous. Another speaks of the Goat Man's origin as a goat breeder, whose bloodlust began after teenage recklessness resulted in the death of some of his stock. Another version, quite enjoyed by some, is the rather specific idea that the Goat Man is an escaped experiment from the Beltsville Research Agricultural Center. The most widely accepted origin story of all, however, takes us to the city of Bowie, Maryland, and comes from a source we've often found attached to the legends in our monster hunt: a newspaper. According to several sources, on October 27, 1971, Prince George's County News published an edition of their paper containing an article focused on the University of Maryland's folklore archives, written by Karen Hostler. The Goat Man legend was discussed among other entries found in the archives, centered around Fletchertown Road. In another edition of the paper, the author provided a special follow-up story. Residents fear Goat Man lives. Dog found decapitated in Old Bowie. A sensational headline for sure, but what details made the Goat Man a suspect? The site where the dog's body was eventually found, Fletchertown Road. The daughter of the family who owned the dog and her friends described disturbing animalistic noises the night of the disappearance. Around the same time, residents of the area claimed to witness a large creature walking on its hind legs near Fletchertown Road. This event eventually led to more articles recirculating the story, with one prominent outlet being the Washington Post. Within a year, it became a popular idea to search for the Goat Man among youth in the area. And naturally, through continued passing on of the legend in written material and word of mouth, it became a tale that grew beyond the state lines of Maryland. And while this is a great line of legend growth for the tale, it still leaves us with nothing to really examine regarding the actual origin of the Goat Man as a known figure without examination of the university records ourselves, a problem regarded by Washington Post writer Monty Reel on November 8, 2000 in this article, Famed Goat Man Forever Held in Dusty Room. Reel's article begins with a description of the Goat Man in line with the mad science angle of the tale. An employee at the National Agricultural Research Center who conducted unspecified research on goats until one day things went terribly wrong, turning an ordinary man into an evil half-man, half-goat hybrid, stalking the woods around Fletchertown Road in isolation and carrying an axe. The problem goes deeper than his alleged ability to hold an axe in mutated hoof hands, however. The Goat Man's origin details are buried in 32 cardboard boxes in a back room of the University of Maryland's McKeldin Library. The lids of the boxes have been taped shut, the dates on some of the files are more than a half-century old, and the paper clips affixed to them have oxidized, bonding onto onion skin typing paper and a rusted crust. They're not, in other words, the kind of files scholars consult every day. Our friend the Bunny Man is mentioned in the files contained within the archives here, the subject of Patricia C. Johnson's 1973 contribution. She collected testimony from 44 residents of Northern Virginia, Maryland, and the district, each of whom told her all they knew about the elusive rabbit-suited man who, like Goat Man, was said to stalk local children with an axe. Is it possible that, as we've seen in other legends, there was cross-contamination of details between Bunny Man and Goat Man? Absolutely, especially considering that neighboring Virginia is where Bunny Man's bridge can be found. But that doesn't account for details still emerging in modern times. Under the Facebook page, Paranormal Activity Network Investigation Center Database, a post was made on April 27, 2016, forwarding an article from Baltimore's WBAL-TV. WBAL-TV received 2 separate emails about some sort of animal at Montpelier Park in Laurel. One woman said it looked like a Sasquatch with horns. A man saw what he thought was a bear, except it doesn't look like a bear. It almost looks like a goat standing on 2 legs. The WBAL-TV article then goes on to list a lot of recorded Goat Man sightings and claims over the decades. June 1963, Huntington, Maryland. A young couple were walking on Zug Road when they observed a peculiar creature staring at them from the edge of the woods. The woman described it as a tall, ragged animal with human-like features. April 1971, Huntington again. A farmer near Fletchertown Road reported seeing a large man-like creature eating the remains of a pig. When the farmer approached the scene, the creature ran off. September 1976, Woodmore, Maryland. A landscaper at the Woodmore Country Club finds unidentified remains on the golf course near Lotsford Road. While attempting to dispose of them, he hears a low growl. As he looks up, he observes a large unknown animal. October 1985, Glendale. Police respond to a report of teenagers making noise at the old Glendale hospital site. While investigating, an officer hears unknown sounds but is unable to locate the source. August 1990, Hyattsville. During a birthday party at Magruder Park, a boy runs into the woods after a ball. Moments later, he screams. When adults arrive, they find him visibly shaken. The boy tells his mother, "It was the dark thing with the red eyes who stands in the corner of my room at night." May 1998, Bowie. A group of teenagers are hanging out near a local bridge when they notice something moving in the weeds. 2 of the teens go to investigate and describe seeing a tall, human-like animal running into the forest. July 2007, Glenarden. A camera crew for WRC-TV, Washington, D.C., is on location to cover a local golf tournament when they notice a strange animal moving in the trees nearby. The cameraman manages to capture a few seconds of video before the animal disappears. And the sightings began in 1957 when a young couple were parked along a lonely country road, Zug Road, when they suddenly heard something banging on the hood of their car. Looking up, they were startled to see a goat-like humanoid staring at them, waving what looked like an axe. The creature instantly turned and dashed into the surrounding woods. There were several more rumored sightings over years. Then in the summer of 1962, the Goat Man was accused of killing 14 people, including 12 children and 2 accompanying adults who had been hiking too close to its apparent lair. The survivors, who, not surprisingly, remained anonymous, claimed that the Goat Man violently hacked its victims with an axe while uttering horrid screams. According to the account, when the local authorities arrived on the scene, all that was left in the carnage were half-eaten limbs and a bloody trail leading to an ominous-looking cave. That was quite the list of sightings over the years. An email sent to a news station in 2016 certainly indicate the legend is alive and well. As for the reality of the tale, that's up to a proper on-foot monster hunt to conclude, but for now, we can say this. There really seems to be something unusual out there in the woods of Maryland. To all residents, be aware, be ready, and try not to be too afraid. Now, I do love introducing you all to lesser-known legends, and you're all quite aware of that. But once in a while, it's good to give due attention to a name that many are familiar with. After all, we need to pay homage to the greats, and not everyone knows the details behind the horrors. So, it's with great pleasure that I take us just east of Maryland to the home of the infamous Jersey Devil. Perhaps the #1 monster in the entire Weird New Jersey collection, because New Jersey, as we all know, is haunted by literally everything. The Jersey Devil is a long-standing cryptid, nearly as popular as Mothman. It's said to live in the pinelands of the state, and if you ever see it, you'll know it. A dog's body, a horse's head, bat wings, horns, a tail, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Unlike other cryptids, this monster comes with a unique touch of hell. According to legend, there was a woman who lived in the Pine Barrens named Mother Leeds. She had 12 children, which many would consider to be quite enough, and so did she. So when she discovered she was pregnant with a 13th child, she cursed, so enraged at her predicament that she swore, "Let it be the devil," or "Let the devil take it." When the child was born, it came out human, then transformed in its mother's arms, becoming a creature only the devil could have spawned. It writhed over Mother Leeds' body, striking out with its appendages, then spread its wings, flew up the chimney, and disappeared into the pines. Ever since that night, residents of New Jersey have claimed encounters or sightings with the Devil's Child, all to varying degrees of believability and intensity. But is there any fact inside the fiction? It's believed that Mother Leeds was a woman named Deborah Leeds, whose husband, Japhet, named 12 children in his will in 1736. They also lived in the area known as Leeds Point, named for the family Leeds. The Leeds members throughout history in the colonial days were, in fact, quite busy at making children, and their prominence in the region did inspire some rather nasty social conflict and quiet anger towards them. It was popular in those times to accuse members of the upper class of being part of impure practices. It's quite easy to imagine that the Leeds family were victims of cruel rumors, such as giving birth to the Devil's Child, especially when they were so fruitful in multiplying. Not helping the Leeds case was the establishment of astrology in the almanac the family printed, spurring rumors that the family overall was into occult business. And then, when the Leeds family crest depicting a dragon-like creature was printed on the almanacs, the idea that they were cozying up to the dragon in the center of hell really began to circulate among the Quakers of New Jersey. So, what about the Jersey Devil has kept it in the minds of the populace beyond just being an old tale in Quaker times? The history of encounters runs deep. In 1820, Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, claimed the Jersey Devil was on his estate while out hunting, and that is a man whose station was far too high for publicly buying into rumors of lower classes. Several complaints of livestock deaths were lodged with authorities and press up through 1841, which included mentions of screams and unbelievable animal noises. On July 27, 1937, the people of Downingtown, Pennsylvania claimed to see an animal with red eyes that seemed similar to the Jersey Devil. In 1951, a group of boys from Gibbstown, New Jersey claimed they spotted a monster fitting the description. In 1960, unexplainable animal activity inspired a $10,000 reward for capturing the Jersey Devil. But perhaps no event was as prominent as the short period in January of 1909, when hundreds of people claimed to have seen the Jersey Devil, all the way to Philadelphia, including riders on a trolley car and police in 2 different jurisdictions who shot at it. There were plenty of hoaxes too, claiming to have caught the Jersey Devil. Some con artists would put together fakes in the attempt to draw crowds, and others would fabricate evidence, like hoofprints. But in all, no one has brought the devil down from the sky, or captured it within the Pine Barrens. And as for those who have tried, it's rather clear that if anybody has gotten close enough, they never survived to let us know. Vampires, goatmen, and devils. But where, oh where are our beloved slashers, our human horrors? We need a little everyday bloodlust to cap off our adventure. Luckily, I have a monster left for us who knows exactly how to make the red run down. This, dear readers, is the terror of The Hook. The story has been around for decades, an urban legend classic. Two teenagers are driving on a date night in park at Lover's Lane, or a hill, or a secluded spot. They adjust their seating for a proper encounter, paying attention only to each other. In the midst of the action, one of them pulls away and asks, "What was that?" The other claims they didn't hear anything. "What's wrong?" "A scratching sound," the first says, "like a branch against the car." The other, the driver, looks around, listens, and declares nothing is wrong. "It's probably just an animal," they say, coaxing their lover back to business. Within moments, the noise comes again, loud enough for both of them to hear it, now on the driver's side. The driver bolts to attention, realizing someone is trying to open the door. They turn on the car, switch on the lights, and catch the form of a stranger in the glow, about to break the glass to get in. Like a bat out of hell, they drive away, pedal to the floor, escaping their attacker. Minutes later, clear of danger and back within reach of other people, the driver slows down and parks. He gets out of the car, still a bit shaky, examines the side, sees long, thin scratch marks, and then the weapon that made them, a large metal hook still hanging from the door handle. This story of the Hook Man is the most popular and has persevered throughout time, even showing up in chain mails in the internet age. What isn't well known is how many variants there are to the story, because there appear to be many Hookmen, and some are far more grisly than their peers. In another version of the lover's parked car scenario, the driver leaves the car to see if someone or something was making a noise. Finding nothing amiss, they return to the car, only to find their lover slaughtered, all the wounds consistent with damage done by a hook. Sometimes the car in question isn't parked for romance but out of necessity, such as a breakdown that forces the driver to go look for help. Either before the breakdown or after, an alert on the car radio informs listeners of an escaped mental patient in the area, and to be on the lookout. Naturally, the person left in the car meets the escapee, who appears holding the driver's severed head by a hook. One such hookman that strikes fear in the hearts of a specific community is the variant in Montville, Connecticut, who haunts Black Ash Road. Legend says that this hookman lost his hand in a car accident that claimed the life of his girlfriend on that road, and in his madness and grief, kidnaps any couples who dare to park there. He would knock them unconscious and drag them to a barn nearby, where their bodies would be found hanging from the rafters upside down. And elsewhere in Connecticut, an hour and a half west in the town of Seymour, the legend changes. Here, the hookman was the caretaker in Great Hill Cemetery, and he did have a hook for a hand. One night, he hung himself in a tree on the grounds, and from that point on, anyone who parked beneath the tree would experience the same sort of horror in the original urban legend, whether they were a pair of lovers or not. In this variant, the crime against the hookman's territory is disturbing his place of death, rather than playing out a happy version of his tragedy. There are as many setups, near getaways, slaughters, and horror variations on the Hookman legend as you can imagine, but the original story, it seems, stems from a Dear Abby letter from November 8, 1960. Dear Abby, if you are interested in teenagers, you will print this story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it doesn't matter because it served its purpose for me. A fellow and his date pulled into their favorite Lover's Lane to listen to the radio and do a little necking. The music was interrupted by an announcer who said there was an escaped convict in the area who had served time for rape and robbery. He was described as having a hook instead of a right hand. The couple became frightened and drove away. When the boy took his girl home, he went around to open the car door for her. Then he saw a hook on the door handle. I will never park to make out as long as I live. I hope this does the same for other kids. Jeanette. So, a big thank you to Jeanette in 1960 for sharing the story that was circulated all across the United States, inspiring decades of hookmen to come, and the popular media depictions after them. The Hookman from I Know What You Did Last Summer, Tony Todd's iconic performance in Candyman, and countless others. One possible origin of the Hookman story may come from the real case of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders in 1946, in which 8 people were attacked, 5 of them dying over the course of 10 weeks. The so-called Phantom of Texarkana attacked couples in their cars on the border of Texas and Arkansas, and prompted such a panic that it inspired the local population to collect arms and form lookouts in hopes of catching the Phantom. The events of these killings inspired the movie The Town That Dreaded Sundown. No mention was ever made of a hook regarding the Phantom of Texarkana, but the basic premise of his hunting habit does match the details of the Hookman legend. Today, there's thankfully a lot less need to find a quiet lane to park for people to enjoy some time together. But the lesson remains. Always be aware of your surroundings, even in a car. Learn well from horror movie victims, and you may find you never have to be one. And here we are, my friends, a mere page away from the back cover. It's been a wonderful hunt, and I do hope you've enjoyed learning about some new stories to share with those who enjoy a good shriek. Though the old AC comics may have fallen away, their legacies and impact live on, and it was a great pleasure to visit an early pillar of horror media with you all. That's all for tonight, everyone. Thanks to all of you for reading, thanks to my supporters on Patreon for keeping my online printing press going, and thanks to Occultcat, my artist, for bringing this whole adventure to life. If you've enjoyed their work, you can commission them or tip them a coffee for their efforts. Links to their Twitter and coffee will be available in the description box below, and I highly encourage following. Thanks for joining me in the dark again this evening. Once more, I'm Nick Nocturne, and I'll be seeing you again real soon. Tonight's monster hunt is complete, but October is far from over. Be careful out there, and until next time, sleep tight.